Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the heart of the wilderness with 8 harrowing tales of camping trips that turned into nightmarish encounters with the darkest corners of human nature and the unforgiving brutality of the wild. In this third episode of our camping horror series, we will uncover the terrifying experiences of 8 individuals who sought peace and solitude in nature, only to discover that sometimes the most isolated places harbor the most disturbing secrets. Each account has been meticulously verified through multiple sources and corroborated with official reports, police statements, and emergency service records. These are not campfire legends passed down through generations, but documented testimonies from survivors who lived through encounters that will forever change how they view the great outdoors. To safeguard the privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, certain names and specific locations have been modified, but the core truth of each terrifying encounter remains untouched. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily horror content that explores the documented darkness lurking in our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of verified nightmares. And let us know in the comments below which story disturbed you the most, or share your own camping horror experiences if you dare to relive them. Now let us begin with our first account, a story that proves that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wilderness walks on 2 legs. I have been camping solo for over 15 years now. Started when I was in college and needed to get away from the noise and stress of dorm life. Back then it was just weekend trips to state parks, nothing too adventurous. But over the years I developed a taste for more remote locations. The kind of places where you do not see another soul for days, where the only sounds are wind through trees and your own breathing. That isolation became my sanctuary. I thought I understood the risks. Weather, injury, getting lost, wildlife encounters. I prepared for all of those things meticulously. What I never prepared for was discovering that sometimes in the wilderness, you are not as alone as you think you are. Last October, I decided to try a trail I had never hiked before in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. It was called the Elk Ridge Trail, a moderately difficult route that promised stunning views and minimal foot traffic. The latter part appealed to me most. According to the ranger station, only about 20 people had signed the trail register in the past month. Perfect for what I was looking for. The weather forecast showed clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s at night, cold but manageable with proper gear. I started the hike around noon on a Friday, planning to camp overnight and return Saturday evening. The trailhead was empty except for my truck, which was exactly what I hoped to see. The first few miles were standard Pacific Northwest terrain, dense forest of Douglas fir and western hemlock, the ground carpeted with fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, that clean scent you only get deep in old-growth forest. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. About 4 miles in, I reached a small clearing where the trail split. The main path continued straight toward the ridge, but there was a smaller, less maintained trail branching off to the left. My map showed it as an old hunting route that eventually reconnected with the main trail about 6 miles further up. I decided to take it, thinking it might offer a different perspective on the landscape and definitely fewer people. The smaller trail was rougher, no doubt about it. Fallen logs blocked the path in several places, forcing me to climb over or detour around them. The undergrowth was thicker, branches catching on my pack and scratching at my legs. But there was something appealing about following a path that clearly saw very little use. I felt like an explorer pushing into untouched territory. Around 5 in the evening, I found what looked like a perfect campsite. A small meadow surrounded by towering trees with a creek running along one edge. The ground was level and relatively free of rocks, I could set up my tent with a clear view of the stars once darkness fell. I dropped my pack and started my routine. Tent first, then organize gear, gather firewood, filter water from the creek. Everything normal and methodical, the way I had done it hundreds of times before. As I was setting up my camp stove to prepare dinner, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away near the edge of the meadow, there was a plastic water bottle hanging from a tree branch. It looked like one of those disposable bottles you buy at gas stations, but it had been deliberately tied to the branch with what looked like paracord. I walked over to get a closer look, thinking maybe another hiker had left it as some kind of trail marker. When I reached the tree, I realized the bottle was one of mine. Same brand, same size, even the same slight dent near the cap that I remembered making when I dropped it earlier that day. But I still had all my water bottles in my pack. I checked to make sure, counting them twice, all accounted for. Yet here was an identical bottle hung deliberately from a tree branch like some kind of offering. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Same brand of water bottle, probably dropped by another hiker weeks ago and caught in the branches by wind. The dent was just wear and tear that happened to look similar to mine. But as I walked back to my campsite, something nagged at me. The paracord had looked fresh, not weathered like it had been hanging there for weeks or months. I tried to push the thought away as I prepared dinner. Freeze-dried beef stew, not exactly gourmet but filling and warm. The sun was setting, painting the meadow in long golden shadows. This was supposed to be my peaceful retreat, my chance to disconnect from the world and clear my head. I was not going to let some random piece of litter ruin the experience. But as darkness settled over the campsite, I found more bottles. 3 more to be exact, each one hanging from a different tree around the perimeter of the meadow. Each one identical to my water bottles. Same brand, same size, same dent. They formed a rough circle around my campsite, like markers defining a territory. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my headlamp and examined each bottle more closely. The paracord on all of them was definitely fresh, probably tied within the last few hours. The bottles themselves looked new too. No algae or dirt stains you would expect from something that had been outdoors for any length of time. Someone had placed these here recently. Someone who had access to the exact same water bottles I carried. I started thinking about the trail I had hiked that day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone else. There had been no other cars at the trailhead, no voices or footsteps behind me on the path. But that did not mean someone had not been following me at a distance, staying just out of sight among the trees. The thought made my skin crawl. I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed even though the night was still warm. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see the dim outlines of the hanging bottles swaying slightly in the breeze. They looked like grotesque Christmas ornaments, decorating my campsite. I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe another hiker had the same water bottles and had hung them for some legitimate reason. Trail markers, bear deterrents, who knows? But every explanation I came up with fell apart under scrutiny. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps circling my tent at what sounded like the same distance as the hanging bottles. The steps would pause for long moments, then resume, moving slowly clockwise around the meadow. I held my breath, listening as hard as I could, trying to determine if it was human or animal. The rhythm was too steady for most wildlife, too measured. But if it was a person, why were they circling my campsite in the middle of the night? I reached for the knife I always kept in my tent, a 4-inch fixed blade that had never been used for anything more threatening than cutting rope. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear the soft crush of pine needles, sometimes fading into the distance only to return minutes later. When dawn finally broke, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour before unzipping my tent and looking outside. The meadow looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful and empty. But the bottles were gone. All 4 of them had been removed, leaving only small marks in the bark where the paracord had rubbed against the branches. I broke camp as quickly as I had ever done anything in my life, stuffed my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it properly, just desperate to get moving. As I shouldered the pack and started toward the trail, I noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth near where my tent had been. They were not mine. The tread pattern was completely different, and they were at least 2 sizes larger than my boots. The footprints formed a complete circle around where my tent had been, maybe 10 feet out from the walls. Whoever had been walking around my campsite had done so multiple times, wearing a path in the forest floor. Near the edge of the meadow, the prints led off into the trees, heading in the same direction as the trail I needed to follow to get back to my truck. I had no choice but to follow the same path. It was the only way back to the trailhead, and my truck was my only way out of the mountains. But every step felt like I was walking deeper into a trap. The boot prints appeared regularly in patches of soft earth, always ahead of me, always following the exact route I needed to take. About 2 miles down the trail, I found more evidence of my stalker. Another water bottle, this one not hanging from a tree but placed carefully on a rock beside the path. It was opened, with about half the water gone. Next to it was a photograph, a Polaroid picture showing me at my campsite the night before, taken from the tree line while I was cooking dinner. I was clearly visible in the frame, unaware that someone was watching and documenting my every move. The photo shook me more than anything else had. This was not some random encounter with a disturbed individual. Someone had been planning this, following me with equipment and intention. They had water bottles identical to mine, a camera, and enough knowledge of the area to track me without being seen. This was predatory behavior, and I was the prey. I abandoned all pretense of normal hiking pace and started running. My pack bounced painfully against my back and branches tore at my clothes, but I did not care. I needed to reach my truck and get out of there before whoever was stalking me decided to escalate beyond psychological intimidation. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking and footsteps that were no longer trying to stay hidden. When I finally reached the trailhead, my truck was not alone. There was another vehicle parked nearby, a dark-colored pickup with tinted windows. The license plate was covered with mud, deliberately obscured. I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, but the tinted glass made it impossible to make out any details. As I approached my truck, the other vehicle started up and slowly drove away, but not before the driver rolled down their window just enough for me to see them watching me leave. I called the police from the first town I reached, about 40 minutes down the mountain highway. The officer who took my report was polite but clearly skeptical. No crime had actually been committed, he pointed out. Someone hiking in public forest land, even if they were following another hiker, was not technically illegal. The photographs were creepy but not necessarily criminal. He took down the information about the license plate but warned me that without clearer evidence of stalking or threats, there was little they could do. That was 3 months ago. I have not been camping alone since then. Every time I think about returning to the wilderness, I remember those water bottles hanging like warnings around my campsite and the sound of footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. The forest I once saw as a sanctuary now feels like a hunting ground where predators with human intelligence can track and toy with their prey. I still have the Polaroid photograph. Sometimes I take it out and study it, looking for clues about who took it and why. In the picture, I look completely relaxed and unaware, focused on my camp stove while someone watched me from the shadows. It serves as a reminder that in the wilderness, the most dangerous predator is not always the one with claws and fangs. Sometimes it walks on two legs and knows exactly how to exploit your need for solitude against you. Be careful when you seek isolation in the wild. Sometimes you find it and sometimes it finds you first. I never considered myself a particularly brave person. When my daughter Emma turned 14, I realized we had drifted apart during those difficult teenage years. She spent most of her time in her room, and our conversations had become limited to logistics about school and chores. That summer, I decided we needed to reconnect, and camping seemed like the perfect opportunity. Just the two of us, away from phones and distractions, with time to actually talk. Emma was initially resistant to the idea. She complained about sleeping on the ground, bugs, and the lack of Wi-Fi. But eventually she agreed, probably more out of guilt than enthusiasm. I chose Pine Ridge State Park because it seemed perfect for a beginner camping trip. Well-maintained facilities, other families around for safety, and flush toilets, which Emma had insisted on as a non-negotiable requirement. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. The campground was busier than I expected, which was actually reassuring. Families with young children occupied most of the sites, and the atmosphere felt safe and welcoming. Our spot was in a loop with about 15 other campsites, close enough to other campers that we could hear the murmur of conversations and occasional laughter from nearby sites. Setting up our tent took longer than anticipated. Emma had zero interest in helping, instead sitting on a picnic table scrolling through her phone trying to find the one bar of cell service that occasionally appeared. I fumbled with tent poles and stakes, sweating in the afternoon heat and questioning my decision to attempt this mother-daughter bonding experience. By the time I got the tent properly secured, the sun was beginning to set. Dinner was dehydrated camping food heated on a small propane stove. Emma picked at her beef stroganoff with obvious disgust, but she did start talking. She told me about problems with friends at school, her anxiety about starting high school in the fall, and her frustration with her father, my ex-husband, who had been largely absent since our divorce 2 years earlier. For the first time in months, we were having a real conversation. As darkness settled over the campground, the temperature dropped into the comfortable 70s. Other campers had small fires going, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the trees. Children played flashlight tag between the sites while their parents cleaned up from dinner. The whole scene felt wholesomely American, like something from a camping brochure. Emma even seemed to be enjoying herself despite her earlier complaints. We zipped ourselves into the tent around 10:30, both exhausted from the day and the emotional conversations. Emma fell asleep quickly, curled up in her sleeping bag with her stuffed elephant, the same one she had slept with since she was 3. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the campground settling down for the night. Conversations grew quieter, fires were extinguished, and eventually the only sounds were insects, the distant hum of the highway and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I must have been asleep for several hours when something woke me. At first, I could not identify what had disturbed my sleep. The campground was quiet, much quieter than it had been when I fell asleep. No voices, no movement from neighboring sites, just an unusual stillness that felt wrong somehow. I checked my phone for the time, 3:17 in the morning. That was when I heard the zipper, slow, deliberate, and coming from the entrance to our tent. Someone was opening our tent from the outside, and they were being very careful about it. The sound was barely audible, just the faint whisper of metal teeth separating one by one. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized someone was trying to get into our tent without waking us. I reached over and gently shook Emma, pressing my finger to her lips when she started to stir. Her eyes went wide when she saw my expression, and she remained perfectly still. We both lay there, hardly breathing, listening to the zipper continue its slow progress. Whoever was outside was taking their time, probably assuming we were both sound asleep. Through the thin nylon of the tent wall, I could see the beam of a small flashlight moving around the entrance. The light was dim and focused, like someone trying to see inside without creating too much illumination. The zipper reached the bottom of the entrance, and I could see a gap beginning to form where someone could look inside or reach through. My mind raced through options. I had bear spray in my pack, but it was on the other side of the tent near the entrance where someone was trying to get in. My phone was next to my sleeping bag, but calling for help would alert whoever was outside that we were awake. Emma was pressed against my side, trembling but staying silent like I had taught her. The gap in the zipper widened, and I could see fingers reaching through, feeling around the interior of the tent. Adult fingers, thick and calloused, moving systematically as if searching for something specific. The person outside was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but with what sounded like excitement or anticipation. Then I heard voices, low whispers coming from outside the tent, and I realized with horror that there was more than one person. I could make out at least 2 different voices, maybe 3, having a quiet conversation just feet from where my daughter and I lay terrified. One voice, deeper than the others, said something about the young one. Another voice, higher pitched, laughed softly and mentioned something about taking her tonight. The words sent ice through my veins. These people were not random thieves or drunken campers. They were here specifically for Emma. The fingers continued exploring the interior of the tent, moving closer to where we lay. Emma squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers, but she remained completely silent. I could see the outline of a head now, someone pressing their face close to the gap in the zipper, trying to see inside our tent. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of remaining frozen with fear, I decided to act. I grabbed my flashlight, the brightest one I had brought, and suddenly turned it on at full power while shouting as loudly as I could. "Help! Help! Someone is trying to get in our tent!" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The figures outside our tent scrambled backward, and I could hear multiple sets of footsteps running away through the campground. I kept shouting, "Help us! Call the police!" while pushing Emma toward the back of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible. Lights began coming on in other tents and RVs around the campground. I heard car doors slamming and voices calling out, asking what was wrong. Within minutes, several other campers had gathered around our tent, and someone had called 911 on their cell phone. When I finally felt safe enough to emerge from the tent, I found that the entrance zipper had been opened about 2 feet, enough for someone to reach inside or for a small person to crawl through. The area around our tent showed clear evidence of multiple people. Footprints in the dirt, broken twigs, and trampled grass where several individuals had been standing or crouching near our tent. The park rangers arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by local police. They took our statement and examined the area around our tent with flashlights, photographing the evidence and taking notes. What they told us made the experience even more frightening than it had been in the moment. 2 other families in the campground reported similar incidents that same night. In one case, a family with a 10-year-old daughter had found their tent partially unzipped in the morning, though they had not awakened during the incident. Another family reported seeing figures moving between tents around 3 in the morning, but had assumed it was campers returning from the bathroom. The police officer explained that this was not the first time they had received reports of this nature from Pine Ridge State Park. Over the past 6 months, there had been several incidents involving groups of individuals targeting campsites with young children, particularly families with teenage daughters. In most cases, the intruders fled when confronted, but there had been one incident 3 months earlier where a 14-year-old girl had gone missing from a campsite. She was found the next day, unharmed but traumatized, several miles away in the woods. The officer strongly recommended that we pack up and leave immediately, rather than staying for the remainder of our planned trip. He explained that the individuals involved in these incidents often returned to the same areas, and there was no guarantee they would not try again the following night. We packed our gear in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by concerned fellow campers who helped us break down our tent and load our car. Emma was quiet during the whole process, but she stayed close to me and kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the trees. During the drive home, Emma finally spoke about what had happened. She told me she had been awake before I shook her, that she had heard footsteps circling our tent for what felt like hours before anyone tried to open the zipper. She had remained perfectly still, pretending to be asleep because she was terrified that any movement would let them know she was aware of their presence. The experience changed both of us in ways that took months to fully understand. Emma developed severe anxiety about sleeping away from home and had nightmares for weeks afterward. I found myself constantly checking locks and looking over my shoulder, especially in parking lots or other isolated areas. We never did try camping again. The bonding experience I had hoped for did happen, but not in the way I had planned. Going through something that terrifying together created a closeness between Emma and me that had been missing for years. She stopped taking her safety for granted, and I stopped assuming that family-friendly locations were automatically safe. 6 months later, we learned that police had arrested 3 men in connection with the incidents at Pine Ridge State Park. They had been targeting families with teenage daughters, using the cover of the campground environment to select potential victims. The men had been watching families during the day, identifying tents with young girls and returning late at night to attempt abductions. The police officer who called to update us said that our decision to make noise and alert other campers had likely prevented a much more serious crime. The men had been prepared to take Emma that night, and they had tools and restraints in their vehicle that suggested they had done this before. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear the sound of a zipper being slowly opened. Emma is in college now, strong and confident, but she has never forgotten that night. We both learned that predators exist in places where you least expect them, and that sometimes the thing that saves you is not being quiet and hoping they go away, but making as much noise as possible and demanding help. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Make noise. Wake up the neighbors. Better to be embarrassed about a false alarm than to become a victim because you were too polite to cause a scene. I started wilderness survival camping as a way to challenge myself and disconnect from the digital world that had consumed my life as a software developer. What began as weekend trips to state parks gradually evolved into more ambitious solo expeditions into remote wilderness areas. I prided myself on my preparation and self-sufficiency. I studied edible plants, learned to purify water from natural sources, and practiced building shelters from materials found in the forest. The trip that changed everything was planned as my most ambitious yet. 2 weeks completely off-grid in the canyon country of southern Utah, living entirely off the supplies I carried and whatever food I could forage from the land. I had done extensive research on the area, studying topographic maps and identifying water sources and potential camping spots. The plan was to hike deep into a remote canyon system, far from any established trails or camping areas. I started the journey in late September, when the desert heat had begun to subside, but temperatures were still warm enough for comfortable camping. My pack contained carefully calculated rations for the first week, along with fishing gear, snares for small game, and a comprehensive field guide to edible desert plants. The second week would test my ability to live entirely off the land, something I had never attempted for more than 3 days. The first few days went exactly as planned. I hiked deep into the canyon following a seasonal stream bed that provided both water and a natural route through the rugged terrain. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering red rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side of the narrow canyon floor. I felt like an explorer discovering uncharted territory, even though I knew satellite imagery had mapped every inch of the area. I established my base camp next to a reliable water source, a series of pools fed by a small spring that emerged from the canyon wall. The location was perfect, sheltered from wind and with enough flat ground for my tent and cooking area. During the day, I explored side canyons and practiced the survival skills I had studied for months. I found edible cactus pads, gathered pine nuts, and even managed to catch 2 small trout from the deeper pools. By the end of the first week, I was feeling confident and accomplished. I had consumed most of my carried food as planned, and my attempts at foraging and fishing had been successful enough to supplement my diet. My body had adjusted to the physical demands of living outdoors, and I felt stronger and more alert than I had in years. That confidence began to erode on day 8. I woke up feeling nauseous and weak, symptoms I initially attributed to the physical demands of the trip and the change in diet. But as the day progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps. By evening, I was unable to keep food down, vomiting up everything I tried to eat, including water. At first, I assumed I had eaten something that disagreed with me. Desert survival guides warn about the dangers of consuming unfamiliar plants, and I thought perhaps I had misidentified something I had foraged the previous day. I decided to stick to bland foods and focus on staying hydrated, expecting the symptoms to pass within a day or 2. They did not pass. By day 10, I had not kept solid food down in over 48 hours. The stomach cramps had intensified to the point where I could barely stand upright. Even small sips of water triggered violent retching that left me weak and dizzy. I began to realize that I was facing a serious medical emergency in one of the most isolated places I had ever been. The nearest road was at least 20 miles away through rugged canyon terrain, and I had not seen another human being since starting the trip. My cell phone had no signal, and my GPS device, while still functional, only served to confirm how far I was from any possibility of help. I was completely on my own, and my body was shutting down. On day 11, desperation began to cloud my judgment. The hunger had become a living thing inside me, gnawing at my insides with relentless intensity. I had not eaten anything substantial in 4 days, and my body was beginning to consume itself. I could feel my muscles weakening, and simple tasks like gathering firewood left me exhausted and breathless. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that still haunts me. While exploring a side canyon in search of anything edible, I found what appeared to be strips of dried meat hanging from the branches of a dead juniper tree. The meat looked professionally prepared, cut into uniform strips and dried to the consistency of jerky. In my weakened state, finding this unexpected source of protein felt like a miracle. I should have been suspicious. I should have questioned how prepared meat could appear in such a remote location, far from any established camping areas or hunting grounds. But hunger had compromised my ability to think clearly. The strips of meat looked clean and properly preserved, and the smell was not unpleasant. My body craved protein so desperately that rational thought became impossible. I ate 3 strips of the dried meat, and within minutes, I felt better than I had in days. The nausea subsided, the stomach cramps eased, and I felt a surge of energy that allowed me to think clearly for the first time since the illness began. I gathered more of the meat, stuffing it into my pack like a starving person hoarding food. It was only later, as I was examining the remaining strips more carefully, that I noticed details that should have alarmed me from the beginning. The cuts were too uniform, too professional. This was not meat that had been prepared by a casual hunter or camper. The preservation was too perfect, and the quantity was too large for someone to have simply lost or abandoned it. More disturbing was the Location itself. The dead juniper tree was positioned in a small clearing that would be visible from several different approaches. The meat had been hung at exactly the right height to be easily spotted by someone walking through the area. This was not a random discovery, it was bait. That realization led to others. My illness had begun shortly after I started drinking from a specific pool that I had been using as my primary water source. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Something had contaminated that water source, and something else had provided a convenient solution in the form of the dried meat. I was being manipulated, and I had fallen for it completely. The thought that something was deliberately poisoning water sources and then offering tainted food to desperate victims sent ice through my veins. I was not alone in this canyon. Something with intelligence and planning ability was here, and it was hunting using methods that targeted the most basic human needs. I abandoned my campsite immediately despite the onset of darkness. Moving through the canyon at night was dangerous, but staying in a location where I had been deliberately targeted felt more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rocky terrain, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The journey out of the canyon took 2 days of difficult hiking while still recovering from the effects of the contaminated water and whatever had been in the dried meat. Several times I found more evidence of the same deliberate baiting. Strips of meat hung from trees positioned where a desperate hiker would easily spot them. Fresh water sources that looked clean but had an odd chemical smell that I now recognized as a warning sign. By the time I reached my truck, I was in critical condition. I drove directly to the nearest hospital where I spent the next 5 days undergoing treatment for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what doctors initially assumed was food poisoning. Blood tests revealed the presence of several toxic compounds that the medical staff could not immediately identify. The most disturbing discovery came when I provided park rangers with detailed information about the location where I had found the dried meat. A search team investigated the area and found evidence of a much larger operation. Hidden caches of prepared meat, systematic contamination of water sources, and signs that multiple people had been through the area recently despite its remoteness. The rangers explained that there had been 3 unexplained disappearances in the general area over the past 2 years. All involved experienced hikers or campers who had planned extended solo trips into remote wilderness areas. In each case, the missing person had told friends or family about their plans to test their survival skills by living off the land for extended periods. Law enforcement eventually classified the incidents as connected to a group that was deliberately targeting people who fit a specific profile. Solo campers with survival experience who planned to stay in remote areas for extended periods were being systematically poisoned and then offered contaminated food when they became desperate enough to accept it. The investigation revealed that the group responsible had been using these methods to isolate and capture people, for reasons that I was never fully briefed on. What I learned was enough to ensure that I never attempted solo wilderness survival again. The rangers strongly advised against discussing the details publicly, as the investigation was ongoing and the perpetrators had not been apprehended. I recovered physically from the experience, though it took months to regain the weight I had lost and to trust my body's responses to food and water again. The psychological impact was more lasting. The wilderness I had seen as a place of challenge and personal growth became a hunting ground where predators used human desperation as a weapon. I still camp occasionally, but never alone and never in remote areas where help is more than a few hours away. I carry emergency communication devices and enough food to last twice as long as any planned trip. Most importantly, I never consume anything I find in the wild, no matter how desperate the situation might become. The dried meat hanging from that dead juniper tree saved my life in the short term, but it was intended to do something much worse in the long term. Sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected sources, but sometimes that help comes with a price that makes death seem preferable. Trust your instincts when something seems too convenient, especially when you are at your most vulnerable. The wilderness will test you in ways you cannot anticipate, and sometimes the greatest danger comes not from nature, but from those who understand how to use your survival instincts against you. Every year for 8 years, the same group of friends gathered for our annual camping trip. We called ourselves the September Squad because we always scheduled the trip for the weekend after Labor Day, when the summer crowds had thinned out but the weather was still warm enough for comfortable sleeping under the stars. There were 6 of us originally, though the group had fluctuated over the years as people moved away or life got in the way. This particular year, only 4 of us could make it. Me, Sarah, Tom, and Jake. We had chosen Sequoia National Forest for our destination, partly because none of us had been there before and partly because Tom had found what he claimed was the perfect campsite through some backpacking forum. Remote enough to avoid crowds, but accessible enough that we would not need to hike more than 3 miles with full packs. We should have paid more attention to the fire restrictions that were posted at every entrance to the forest. The signs were everywhere, warning about extreme fire danger due to drought conditions and unusually high temperatures for September. But we had been car camping for years, and we assumed the warnings were the usual bureaucratic overcaution. We planned to have a campfire just like we always did. It was tradition. The first sign that something was wrong came Friday evening as we were setting up camp. The ranger who checked our permits mentioned that there were several small fires burning in areas north of where we planned to camp. Nothing to worry about, he said, but he recommended that we keep our radio tuned to the emergency frequency and be prepared to leave quickly if conditions changed. We thanked him and made jokes about ranger paranoia as soon as he drove away. That night, the sunset was spectacular. The entire western sky burned red and orange, with colors more intense than any of us had ever seen. Tom took dozens of photos trying to capture the dramatic light painting the mountains and forests. Sarah mentioned that the air smelled like smoke, but we attributed it to distant campfires from other camping areas. We built our own fire as planned, roasting hot dogs and making s'mores like we had done every year since college. The familiar ritual was comforting, and we fell into the easy conversation and shared memories that made these trips special. None of us wanted to think about the fact that this might be our last September squad camping trip. Sarah was getting married in the spring and moving to Portland. Tom had been talking about taking a job overseas. Nothing stays the same forever. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, but the smell of smoke was stronger. When I looked to the north, I could see a haze hanging over the ridgeline that had not been there the night before. Jake suggested we hike up to a higher viewpoint to get a better sense of what was happening. But the rest of us voted to stay at camp and enjoy our traditional lazy morning of coffee and pancakes, cooked over the camp stove. By noon, the wind had picked up significantly. What started as a gentle breeze became steady gusts that rattled the trees and sent dust swirling around our campsite. The air temperature seemed to be rising every hour, and the humidity dropped to the point where our lips were cracking and our throats felt constantly dry. The radio crackled to life around 2 in the afternoon with an evacuation advisory for areas north of our location. The announcement was calm and professional, recommending that campers in specified zones consider leaving as a precautionary measure. Our campsite was not in the designated evacuation zone, but it was close enough that we could see the areas being evacuated from our location. We debated whether to pack up and leave. Tom and Jake wanted to stay, arguing that we were outside the evacuation zone and that leaving would waste the weekend we had all planned for months. Sarah and I were more concerned, especially after the wind shifted and began blowing directly from the north, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of burning forest. The decision was made for us around 4 o'clock when the evacuation advisory became a mandatory evacuation order, and the zone was expanded to include our campsite. A ranger drove through the area with a loudspeaker, ordering all campers to break camp immediately and proceed to the main highway via the access road. We started packing quickly, but 8 years of accumulated camping gear takes time to organize and load properly. We had 2 cars between the 4 of us, and we had to decide what was essential and what could be left behind if necessary. The process took longer than it should have because we kept stopping to watch the sky, which was growing darker and more ominous by the hour. By 5:30, we were finally packed and ready to leave. That was when we discovered that the access road we had used to reach the campsite was blocked. A tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road, probably blown down by the increasingly strong winds. The tree was too large for us to move, and there was no room for the cars to drive around it. Tom and Jake tried to clear the road using a small chainsaw that Tom kept in his truck for camping trips. They managed to cut through some of the smaller branches, but the main trunk was too thick for the small saw, and the chain broke after 20 minutes of hard work. We were trapped. The wind continued to strengthen and the sky continued to darken. What had started as a hazy sunset effect now looked like an approaching thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. Just smoke, thick and black and moving toward us with frightening speed. Sarah found an old logging road on her map that showed a route out of the area, but it meant driving deeper into the forest before turning back toward the highway. None of us liked the idea of driving away from safety, but it was the only option we could identify. We decided to try the logging road and hope it was still passable. The logging road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle. We drove in convoy with Tom's truck leading because it had higher clearance, followed by my SUV with Sarah and Jake as passengers. The road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching what should have been the junction with another road that would take us back toward the highway. The junction was not there. Either our map was wrong, or the road had been closed and the junction removed. We found ourselves at the end of a dead-end road with no way to turn around easily and no clear route to safety. Behind us, the sky was now completely black, and the wind was carrying burning embers that landed on the dry grass and immediately caught fire. That was when we realized we were in a situation that could kill us. The fire was moving faster than we had imagined possible, and we were trapped in an area with limited options for escape. The logging road was too narrow to turn around quickly, and backing out would take longer than we had. Tom made the decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of trying to retreat back down the logging road, he drove his truck straight into the small creek that ran alongside the dead end. The water was only about 2 feet deep, but it was flowing and surrounded by rocks and gravel that would not burn easily. We followed his lead, driving my SUV into the creek bed and positioning both vehicles as close to the water as possible. We soaked towels and sleeping bags in the creek water and covered the cars, then huddled in the creek itself, using the vehicles as shields against the radiant heat that was beginning to build. The fire reached us around 7 o'clock. I have never experienced anything like the sound of an approaching wildfire. It sounds like a freight train combined with a waterfall, a constant roar that drowns out everything else. The heat was incredible, like opening an oven door but multiplied by 1,000. Even with wet towels covering us and creek water surrounding us, the air became so hot that each breath felt like it was burning my lungs. We stayed in the creek for 6 hours while the fire burned around us. Trees exploded like bombs when the fire reached them. The sound was terrifying, sharp cracks followed by crashes as burning timber fell across the creek and the road. Several times, burning branches fell close enough to us that we had to dive underwater to avoid being hit. The cars were badly damaged but provided crucial protection from the radiant heat. The paint bubbled and peeled, the tires melted, and all the plastic components warped or melted completely. But the metal shells held together and gave us something to shelter behind when the heat became unbearable. Around 1 in the morning, the fire began to move past our location. The roaring sound gradually diminished, and the air temperature started to drop. We emerged from the creek to find ourselves in a completely changed landscape. Everything around us had burned. The trees were black skeletons, the ground was covered with ash, and the air was still thick with smoke. We spent the rest of the night in the creek bed, too exhausted and traumatized to attempt any movement in the darkness. At dawn, we started walking out along the burned remains of the logging road, leaving the damaged cars behind. We walked for 8 miles through the blackened forest before reaching the main highway, where we were picked up by emergency personnel. Both Sarah and Jake suffered second-degree burns on their arms and backs. Tom lost the hearing in his left ear permanently due to the noise and pressure from the fire. I developed respiratory problems that lasted for months and still affect me during allergy season. We learned later that the fire had consumed over 50,000 acres and destroyed hundreds of structures. 14 people died, including 3 other campers who had been caught in areas without access to water. Our decision to stay in the creek probably made the difference between life and death. The September squad never camped together again after that weekend. The experience changed all of us in ways that made it impossible to recapture the carefree attitude that had made our annual trip special. We stayed friends, but the shared trauma of that night created a bond that was different from anything we had experienced before. I still camp occasionally, but never during fire season, and never without multiple escape routes planned in advance. I carry emergency radios, satellite communicators, and more water than any reasonable person would need for a weekend trip. Most importantly, I never ignore evacuation warnings or fire restrictions, no matter how inconvenient they might be. Nature does not negotiate, and it does not make exceptions for traditions or convenience. When the forest decides to burn, everything in its path becomes fuel, and your only chance of survival is to respect its power and get out of the way before it arrives. My 3 closest friends from college and I had been planning our graduation camping trip for months. After 4 years of studying, exams, and stress, we wanted to celebrate our degrees with something memorable and adventurous. We chose a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia that promised challenging hiking, scenic views, and the kind of wilderness experience that would give us stories to tell for years to come. The group consisted of me, my roommate Marcus, and our friends Kevin and Tyler. We were all reasonably experienced hikers, having done numerous day trips and weekend camping excursions throughout our college years. This trip was planned as a 4-day backpacking adventure, hiking deeper into the mountains than any of us had gone before, far from the popular sections of the trail that attract crowds of casual hikers. We started our hike on a Thursday morning in late May when the weather was warm but not yet oppressively hot, and the spring foliage was at its most beautiful. The trail was well marked and maintained, winding through dense forest of oak, maple, and pine. We made good time during the first day, covering about 8 miles before setting up camp at a designated backcountry site near a small stream. The first night was everything we had hoped for. We cooked dinner over our camp stoves, shared stories about our college experiences and plans for the future, and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest around us. Marcus was starting a job with an engineering firm in North Carolina. Tyler had been accepted to graduate school in Colorado, and Kevin was planning to travel through Europe before settling down to a career. This felt like the end of one chapter of our lives and the beginning of something new. The second day took us deeper into the mountains along a less traveled section of trail that required more navigation skills and physical endurance. The path was narrower and less well-maintained, with fallen trees blocking the route in several places and stream crossings that required careful attention to avoid slipping on wet rocks. But the sense of accomplishment when we reached our planned campsite for the second night made the extra effort worthwhile. It was during the second night that we first encountered the group that would turn our celebration into a nightmare. We had finished dinner and were sitting around our small camp stove, playing cards and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere when we heard voices approaching through the forest. At first, we were pleased to encounter other hikers, thinking it would be nice to meet fellow outdoor enthusiasts and perhaps share stories about our experiences on the trail. 3 men emerged from the darkness beyond our campfire light, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, carrying backpacks and hiking gear that looked well used and professional. They seemed friendly enough initially, introducing themselves as experienced backpackers who had been hiking this section of trail for several days. They asked about our route and destination, and we shared our plans openly, thinking we were just engaging in the kind of casual conversation that happens between hikers who encounter each other in the wilderness. But something about their demeanor made me uncomfortable. They asked too many specific questions about where we had started, how long we planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew exactly where we were. When Tyler mentioned that we had told our families and friends our general itinerary but not our specific campsite locations, I noticed the 3 men exchange glances that made my stomach tighten with unease. They lingered at our campsite longer than seemed normal for casual trail encounters. Most hikers who meet in the backcountry might chat for 15 or 20 minutes before moving on to their own campsites, but these men stayed for over an hour, asking increasingly personal questions about our backgrounds, our families, and our financial situations. When Kevin mentioned that his parents were wealthy and had funded his college education, their interest became even more intense. Around 10 o'clock, they finally said goodnight and disappeared back into the forest, claiming they were going to set up their own camp about a mile further up the trail. We watched them leave with relief, but none of us felt comfortable enough to discuss what had made the encounter so unsettling. Instead, we cleaned up our campsite, secured our food in bare canisters, and went to sleep earlier than we had planned. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling our campsite. At first, I thought it might be animals investigating our area, but the rhythm and pattern of the steps were clearly human. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening as multiple sets of feet moved quietly through the forest around our tents, stopping periodically as if the people were observing us or discussing something in whispers too quiet for me to understand. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear breathing and the rustle of clothing, sometimes fading into the distance before returning. I wanted to wake my friends, but I was afraid that any movement or noise might trigger whatever these people were planning. Instead, I remained motionless, trying to control my breathing and hoping that whatever was happening would resolve peacefully. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard voices that were louder and clearer than the previous whispers. The 3 men from earlier were back, and they were no longer trying to hide their presence. One of them was saying something about the rich one and easy money, while another voice discussed the best way to handle 4 of them without noise. That was when I realized we were being targeted for robbery and possibly worse. These were not casual hikers who had happened upon our campsite by chance. They had been scouting us during their earlier visit, gathering information about our financial backgrounds and assessing our vulnerability. Now they were planning an attack that would take place while we were asleep and helpless in our tents. I reached over and quietly shook Marcus awake, whispering that we were in danger and needed to wake the others without alerting the men outside. Marcus immediately understood the gravity of the situation and began carefully rousing Kevin and Tyler while I listened to the ongoing conversation outside our tents. The men were discussing which one of us they thought would be most likely to resist, and they were debating whether to use weapons to intimidate us or to rely on surprise and superior numbers. One of them mentioned having a knife, while another talked about a piece, which I assumed meant a gun. The casual way they discussed violence made it clear that this was not their first time targeting hikers in remote areas. We had to make a decision quickly. Our tents were positioned in a small clearing with limited escape routes, and the men seemed to know the area better than we did. Running blindly into the forest in darkness would be dangerous, but staying and hoping they would leave seemed even more dangerous given what we had overheard. Marcus made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed during our setup the night before that there was a steep slope leading down to a creek about 50 yards from our campsite. The slope was covered with thick undergrowth that would provide concealment, and the creek might offer a route away from the area that would be difficult for our pursuers to follow in darkness. We gathered only our most essential items, leaving our tents and most of our gear behind to avoid making noise with zippers and buckles. Moving as quietly as possible, we crawled out of our tents and began making our way toward the slope, staying low and using the trees for cover. We almost made it undetected. We were within 20 yards of the slope when Kevin stepped on a branch that snapped loudly in the quiet forest. Immediately, the conversation outside our camp stopped, followed by the sound of running footsteps and angry voices as the men realized their intended victims were escaping. What followed was a terrifying chase through dense forest in near total darkness. We crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over fallen logs, and slid down steep slopes while being pursued by 3 men who seemed to know the terrain much better than we did. Behind us, we could hear them shouting instructions to each other and coordinating their pursuit in a way that suggested they had done this before. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. We managed to reach the creek and followed it downstream, hoping that the sound of running water would mask our movements and that the rocky creek bed would make it harder for them to track us. Several times we had to stop and hide while our pursuers passed nearby, sometimes close enough that we could hear their breathing and cursing. Eventually, we reached a section of the creek where it joined a larger stream, and we followed that downstream until we found an old logging road that led back toward the main trail system. By dawn, we had put enough distance between ourselves and our attackers that we felt relatively safe, though we continued hiking as quickly as possible toward the nearest trailhead. We reached my car around noon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Tyler had suffered some cuts and bruises from crashing through the underbrush, and all of us were dehydrated and emotionally drained. But we were alive and free. We drove directly to the nearest police station and reported the incident, providing detailed descriptions of the 3 men and the location where the encounter had taken place. The police took our report seriously and sent officers to investigate the area, but they found our abandoned campsite empty except for our gear, which had been ransacked and most of our valuable items stolen. There was no sign of the 3 men, and despite a search of the surrounding area, they were never located or identified. We learned later that there had been several similar incidents reported in remote areas of the Appalachian Trail over the previous 2 years. Groups of experienced hikers targeting college students and other young campers who appeared to have money and were hiking in isolated areas. In most cases, the victims had been robbed and threatened, but not seriously injured. In one case, however, a solo hiker had been found dead under circumstances that suggested murder during a robbery attempt. Our graduation camping trip became a story of survival rather than celebration, and the experience changed all of our attitudes about wilderness camping and personal safety. We remained friends, but we never attempted another backcountry camping trip together. The trust and sense of security that made such adventures enjoyable had been permanently damaged by our encounter with predators who use the wilderness as their hunting ground. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about people you encounter in remote areas. The wilderness attracts people seeking solitude and adventure, but it also provides cover for those with darker intentions who understand that help is far away and witnesses are few. I had been dreaming about a solo winter camping trip for years. As someone who prided herself on being prepared and self-sufficient, I wanted to prove that I could handle the most challenging conditions nature could throw at me. I spent months researching cold weather gear, studying winter survival techniques, and planning every detail of what I hoped would become an annual tradition of testing my limits against the elements. The location I chose was the White Mountain region of New Hampshire, specifically an area known for its challenging winter conditions, but also for its beauty when covered in snow. I selected a campsite near a frozen lake, about 4 miles from the nearest parking area, via a well-marked but unplowed winter trail. The forecast showed temperatures dropping to around 10 degrees below zero, with light snow expected but nothing that seemed dangerous for someone with proper equipment and experience. My gear was the result of months of research and a significant financial investment. A 4-season mountaineering tent rated for extreme cold, a sleeping bag designed for temperatures down to -20 degrees, and a comprehensive collection of winter camping equipment that filled 2 large backpacks. I had tested everything during day trips and overnight excursions closer to home, and I felt confident that I was prepared for anything the mountains could deliver. The hike to my chosen campsite took longer than expected due to the depth of the snow and the weight of my gear, but the effort was worth it when I emerged from the forest into the clearing beside the frozen lake. The landscape was pristine and beautiful, with snow-covered peaks rising on all sides and a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. This was exactly the kind of solitude and natural beauty I had been seeking. Setting up camp in winter conditions requires careful attention to detail that summer camping does not demand. I used snowshoes to pack down a platform for my tent, ensuring that the base was level and firm enough to support the structure without creating pressure points that could damage the floor. The tent itself was designed to handle heavy snow loads, with a geodesic dome structure that distributed weight evenly across multiple support poles. The first night went perfectly. Despite temperatures that dropped to 15 below zero, my sleeping system kept me comfortable, and I woke up refreshed and excited to spend a full day photographing the winter landscape. I cooked breakfast on my winter-rated stove, melted snow for water, and felt a deep satisfaction at successfully executing all the skills I had spent so long learning and practicing. The weather began to change on the second day. What started as light snow flurries gradually intensified throughout the afternoon, and the temperature began dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. By evening, the snow was falling heavily and the wind had picked up enough to create significant drifting around my campsite. I checked the weather radio and discovered that the storm system was larger and more intense than meteorologists had initially predicted. The radio forecast called for freezing rain followed by heavy snow, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero. This was beyond what I had prepared for, and I began to consider the possibility of packing up and hiking out immediately, despite the approaching darkness and deteriorating conditions. That decision was made for me around midnight when I was awakened by a sharp cracking sound followed by the sensation of my tent collapsing around me. The weight of accumulated snow and ice had exceeded the structural capacity of even my high-end mountaineering tent, and one of the main support poles had snapped under the load. Within minutes, my shelter went from a warm, protective cocoon to a twisted mass of fabric and broken aluminum that provided no protection from the storm. The temperature inside the collapsed tent dropped immediately as wind and snow found their way through gaps in the fabric. My sleeping bag, which had been perfectly adequate when used inside a proper shelter, became insufficient when exposed to the full force of the storm. I could feel my core body temperature beginning to drop as I struggled to extract myself from the tangle of tent fabric and broken poles. Getting out of the collapsed tent in the middle of a winter storm was like emerging into a frozen hell. The wind was strong enough to knock me off balance, and the combination of snow and freezing rain created visibility of only a few feet in any direction. My headlamp beam was immediately swallowed by the swirling precipitation, and I realized that I was facing a survival situation that could easily become fatal within hours. My first priority was finding or creating some kind of shelter that could protect me from the wind and precipitation. The collapsed tent was useless, and the nearest tree line was at least 100 yards away through knee-deep snow. I remembered reading about snow caves as emergency shelters, but digging one would require more time and energy than I might have available given how quickly my body temperature was dropping. Instead, I decided to try to create a snow wall that could provide at least partial protection from the wind. Using my snowshoes as makeshift shovels, I began piling snow into a barrier on the windward side of where my tent had been. The work was exhausting in the extreme cold, and I had to stop frequently to warm my hands and prevent frostbite in my fingers. As I worked, I began to recognize the early symptoms of hypothermia setting in. My thinking became sluggish, my movements grew clumsy, and I started making decisions that I knew were irrational even as I made them. The most dangerous was when I began to feel warm despite being in a life-threatening situation. And I actually considered removing some of my outer clothing layers because they seemed unnecessarily bulky. That false sense of warmth is one of the final stages of hypothermia, and recognizing it probably saved my life. I forced myself to put on additional layers instead of removing them, and I increased my physical activity level to generate more body heat, even though the exertion was exhausting my already limited energy reserves. The snow wall I had constructed provided some relief from the wind, but it was not enough to create a truly warm shelter. My sleeping bag was becoming saturated with snow and losing its insulating properties, and my core body temperature continued to drop despite my efforts to stay warm. I realized that I needed to make a difficult decision about whether to stay and try to wait out the storm or attempt to hike out in dangerous conditions. The decision was made for me when my water bottles froze solid despite being stored inside my jacket close to my body heat. This indicated that the temperature had dropped below the threshold where my current gear and shelter could keep me alive indefinitely. I had to move or risk dying in place as my body gradually shut down from the cold. Hiking out in whiteout conditions with no visibility was extremely dangerous, but staying was becoming more dangerous by the hour. I packed only the most essential items, abandoning most of my gear to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The trail back to my truck was marked, but the markers would be difficult to find in the storm, and missing the trail could mean wandering in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia became fatal. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through deep snow while being battered by wind and freezing rain that cut through even my best cold weather gear. Several times I lost the trail completely and had to backtrack to find the markers, wasting precious energy and time, while my core body temperature continued to drop. My hands and feet became completely numb, and I began to lose the fine motor control needed to operate zippers, buckles, and other essential gear. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I fell through what I thought was solid snow into a hidden creek that had not completely frozen. The ice water soaked through my boots and lower legs, creating an immediate emergency that could lead to severe frostbite within minutes. I managed to get out of the creek, but now I was dealing with wet feet and sub-zero temperatures, which significantly increased the risk of losing toes or worse. I reached my truck just as dawn was breaking, after 6 hours of the most difficult hiking I had ever attempted. My hands were so numb that I could not operate the door handle or start the engine immediately. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes running the heater and slowly warming my extremities before I trusted myself to drive safely on mountain roads that were now covered with ice from the storm. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I had suffered frostbite on 3 fingers of my left hand and both of my big toes. The damage to 2 of the fingers was severe enough to require amputation of the tips, a permanent reminder of how quickly winter conditions can become life-threatening, even for experienced and well-prepared campers. The gear I abandoned at the campsite was never recovered. When rescue personnel checked the area after the storm passed, they found my collapsed tent buried under 3 feet of snow and ice. The shelter that had seemed so robust and reliable had been completely overwhelmed by conditions that, while extreme, were not unprecedented for that region during winter. I learned that winter camping requires not just good gear and knowledge, but also the wisdom to recognize when conditions exceed your preparation, and the courage to retreat before a challenging situation becomes a survival emergency. The mountains do not care how much money you spent on equipment or how many books you have read about cold weather camping. Nature sets the rules, and those rules can change without warning. Respect those rules or pay a price that might be more than you are willing to accept. I still camp, but never again alone in winter conditions and never without multiple backup plans for shelter failure and emergency evacuation. The cold does not negotiate and it does not forgive mistakes. When winter shows its true power, your only choice is to get out of its way or become another cautionary tale for the next person who thinks they can conquer the elements through preparation alone. I have been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, specializing in capturing rare bird species in their natural habitats. Most photographers focus on the more accessible subjects, but I built my reputation by documenting species that few people ever see in the wild. This required spending weeks in remote locations, often camping alone in areas where human presence was minimal, and wildlife behavior remained undisturbed by civilization. The assignment that changed everything came from a nature magazine that wanted documentation of the northern spotted owl in old-growth forests of Oregon. The species had been declining for decades, and recent conservation efforts were showing some promise, but photographic evidence of their recovery was limited. The magazine offered a substantial fee for quality images of the owls in their nesting habitat during the critical breeding season. I chose a section of the Cascade Range that had been protected from logging for over 50 years. The forest was pristine, with Douglas fir trees over 300 feet tall, and an understory that had developed the complex structure that spotted owls require for successful nesting. Access required a 5-mile hike on an unmaintained trail, followed by another 2 miles of bushwhacking through dense undergrowth to reach the area where the owls had been reported. Setting up camp in such a remote location required careful planning. I carried enough supplies for 10 days, including a specialized telephoto lens system that weighed almost 20 pounds by itself. The campsite I chose was a small clearing next to a seasonal stream positioned to provide access to the 3 different areas where I hoped to find active owl nests. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I located 2 active nests and managed to photograph the adult owls during their dawn and dusk hunting periods. The photographs were exceptional, showing the birds in the kind of pristine habitat that most people assume no longer exists. I felt confident that I had already captured enough material to satisfy the magazine assignment. It was on the 4th morning that I noticed something was wrong with the forest. I woke up before dawn, as I always did, to prepare for the early morning photography session. But instead of the usual symphony of bird calls that typically greets the sunrise in old-growth forest, there was complete silence. Not just quiet, but absolute silence. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. In 12 years of wilderness photography, I had never experienced anything like it. Forests are never completely silent unless something has disturbed the normal balance of wildlife activity. My first thought was that a large predator might be in the area. Bears or mountain lions can cause other animals to go quiet, but even then the silence is usually temporary and localized. This silence was different. It felt oppressive, almost artificial. I packed my photography gear and hiked to the first owl nest location, hoping that normal forest sounds would resume as I moved through the area. They did not. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that I could not identify. When I reached the nesting site, I discovered that the owls were gone. Not just absent for hunting, but completely gone. The nest itself looked abandoned, with none of the fresh pellets or droppings that indicate active use. It was as if the birds had simply vanished overnight, leaving behind a perfectly intact but sterile nesting site. The second nesting location showed the same pattern. No birds, no signs of recent activity, and an eerie emptiness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I have spent enough time in wilderness areas to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I needed to leave this place immediately. But professional curiosity overrode my survival instincts. I had never documented a phenomenon like this, and the photographer in me wanted to understand what could cause an entire forest ecosystem to go silent simultaneously. I decided to spend one more day investigating before packing up and leaving. That decision almost cost me my life. As I was hiking back toward my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed movement in the canopy above me. At first, I thought it might be the missing owls finally returning to their territory. I stopped and raised my binoculars to get a better look at whatever was moving among the branches. What I saw through the binoculars made no sense. The trees were full of shapes that looked like animals, but not any animals I could identify. They were hanging from the branches in clusters, completely motionless like some kind of bizarre fruit. The shapes were roughly the size of small mammals, but their proportions were wrong, and they appeared to be suspended by something that was not visible through the binoculars. I switched to my telephoto camera lens to get a clearer view of what I was seeing. Through the high-powered lens, the shapes became more distinct, but also more disturbing. They were definitely animal remains, but they had been arranged in the trees in a systematic pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Small mammals, birds, even what looked like larger animals, all suspended from branches at roughly the same height throughout the forest canopy. The arrangement was too organized to be natural. Predators do not hang their prey in geometric patterns, and scavengers do not typically leave carcasses suspended in trees. This looked like the work of something that understood spatial relationships and had the ability to manipulate objects with precision and planning. I took dozens of photographs documenting what I was seeing while trying to understand what could create such a display. The images showed clearly that the suspended animals had been dead for different lengths of time. Some appeared fresh while others were in various stages of decomposition. This suggested that whatever was responsible had been active in this area for an extended period. As I was photographing the suspended remains, I realized that I was looking at the missing wildlife from the forest. The birds, small mammals, and insects that should have been creating the normal sounds of a healthy ecosystem were all here, hanging dead in the trees like some macabre art installation. The silence of the forest suddenly made perfect sense. There were no living animals left to make noise. Something had systematically killed everything in a large area and arranged the bodies in this grotesque display. And I was alone in the middle of it. I packed my gear and started hiking back toward my campsite as quickly as the terrain would allow. The forest felt different now that I understood what had happened to its normal inhabitants. Every shadow could be hiding whatever predator was responsible for the carnage in the trees. Every sound, and there were very few, made me stop and listen for signs of approaching danger. When I reached my campsite, I found evidence that whatever had killed the forest animals had also been investigating my presence. My tent had been moved slightly, and items from my camp kitchen had been rearranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched and repositioned. I broke camp immediately, despite the approaching darkness. Hiking out of the forest at night was dangerous, but staying in an area where an unknown predator was actively hunting seemed more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rough trail, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The hike out took 6 hours instead of the usual 3, partly because of the difficult night conditions and partly because I was moving as quietly as possible to avoid attracting attention. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I felt like I had escaped from something that I still could not fully understand. I developed the photographs when I returned to civilization, hoping that they would provide clues about what I had witnessed. The images clearly showed the arranged animal remains, but they also revealed details that I had not noticed while taking them. In several frames, there were shapes moving in the background, partially hidden by the tree trunks and branches. The shapes were large, much larger than any native wildlife in the area. They moved with a deliberate purpose that suggested intelligence, and they seemed to be aware of my presence even while I was photographing the suspended animals. In one particularly clear image, something that looked almost human was visible in the deep shadows between the trees, watching me from a distance. I never published those photographs, and I never wrote the article about the spotted owls for the magazine. The images were too disturbing, and the implications of what they showed were too frightening to share publicly. Instead, I submitted a report to the State Wildlife Agency, describing the area as temporarily unsuitable for research due to an unknown ecological disturbance. I have not returned to that forest, and I have not spoken publicly about what I witnessed there. But sometimes when I am working in other remote areas, I find myself looking up into the tree canopy, checking to make sure that nothing unnatural is hanging from the branches above me. The forest taught me that not all predators hunt on the ground, and not all dangers in the wilderness can be identified from field guides or survival manuals. Trust your instincts when the forest goes silent. There is always a reason, and sometimes that reason is something you do not want to encounter alone. After years of working in corporate marketing in downtown Chicago, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines, office politics, and the constant stress of city life. I had been dreaming of taking a solo retreat to reconnect with nature and clear my mind before making some major life decisions about my career and relationships. I chose Yellowstone National Park for my destination, specifically a lesser-known area called the Beckler region, known for its pristine wilderness, natural hot springs, and relatively few visitors compared to the main tourist areas of the park. I planned the trip as a 5-day solo camping and hiking adventure, carrying everything I needed in a backpack and relying on natural water sources for drinking water. I had researched the area extensively, studying topographic maps and identifying reliable streams and springs that would provide clean water throughout my planned route. The Beckler region is famous for its thermal features and pristine water quality, and park literature described several springs as having water so pure that no treatment was necessary. The first 2 days exceeded all my expectations. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling meadows, dense forests, and crystal-clear streams meandering through valleys that felt untouched by human activity. I encountered very few other hikers, which was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude was healing, allowing me to disconnect from the noise and pressure of my daily life and reconnect with the natural world. My campsite on the second night was positioned near a natural spring that emerged from a rocky hillside and formed a small pool before flowing into a larger creek. The water was incredibly clear, and the spring itself was surrounded by lush vegetation that indicated a reliable year-round water source. I had been filtering and treating water from streams during the first part of my trip, but this spring looked so pristine that I decided to drink directly from the source, following the advice in my guidebook that suggested many of the thermal springs in the area were safe for direct consumption. The water tasted clean and refreshing, with a slight mineral taste that I attributed to the natural thermal activity in the area. I filled my water bottles from the spring and used the water for cooking dinner and washing dishes. That evening, I felt more relaxed and content than I had in months, sitting by my small campfire and watching the stars emerge in a sky unobscured by city lights. I woke up during the third night feeling nauseous and dizzy. At first, I attributed the symptoms to the change in altitude and diet, thinking that my body was just adjusting to the physical demands of backpacking and camping. But as the night progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps that made it difficult to remain comfortable in any position. By morning, I was unable to keep food down and was experiencing frequent bouts of vomiting that left me weak and dehydrated. I tried to treat the symptoms by resting and sipping small amounts of water, but even tiny sips triggered more nausea and vomiting. I began to realize that I was dealing with something more serious than simple altitude sickness or dietary adjustment. My condition continued to deteriorate throughout the day. The stomach cramps became so severe that I could barely stand upright, and the vomiting became so frequent and violent that I was bringing up nothing but bile and stomach acid. I was losing fluids faster than I could replace them, and I began to recognize the early signs of serious dehydration, including dizziness, confusion, and difficulty concentrating. By the fourth day, I was in critical condition. I had not been able to keep solid food down for over 36 hours, and my attempts to stay hydrated were failing because even water triggered immediate vomiting. I was becoming dangerously weak, and I realized that I might be facing a medical emergency that could become life-threatening without proper treatment. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that explained my illness and filled me with horror about what I had been drinking. While exploring the area around the spring to see if I could find any obvious sources of contamination, I followed the flow of water upstream to its source in the rocky hillside. What I found there made me realize that the pristine spring I had been using as my primary water source was not as clean as it appeared. About 50 yards upstream from where the spring emerged, I found the partially decomposed carcass of a large elk that had apparently died and fallen into the water source several weeks or months earlier. The animal had been dead long enough that most of the soft tissue had rotted away, but the remaining bones and hide were still contaminating the water that fed the spring I had been drinking from. The sight of the decomposing elk explained everything. The bacteria and toxins from the rotting carcass had been carried downstream by the underground water flow, contaminating the spring that I had assumed was safe for direct consumption. I had been drinking water that was heavily contaminated with dangerous bacteria and possibly other toxic compounds from the decomposing animal. Understanding the source of my illness did not improve my situation. I was still severely dehydrated and unable to keep liquids down, and I was now at least a day's hike from the nearest ranger station or road access. My physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was beginning to experience symptoms that suggested serious complications from the bacterial infection and dehydration. I made the difficult decision to abandon my planned route and attempt to reach help as quickly as possible, even though hiking in my weakened condition was dangerous. I packed only the most essential items, leaving most of my camping gear behind to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through difficult terrain while battling constant nausea, dizziness, and weakness. Several times during the hike out, I had to stop and rest because I was too weak to continue. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, and I began to worry that I would collapse before reaching help. My thinking was becoming increasingly confused due to dehydration and the effects of the bacterial infection, and I found myself making poor decisions about route finding and rest stops. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I collapsed on the trail and could not get back up. I was too weak to continue hiking, and I realized that I might die in that spot if other hikers did not find me soon. I used the last of my strength to move to a visible location beside the trail and to set up my emergency signaling equipment, hoping that someone would pass by before my condition became critical. I was found by a group of day hikers about 3 hours later, unconscious and severely dehydrated. They immediately called for emergency medical assistance and provided basic first aid while waiting for park rangers and paramedics to arrive. The rescue team had to carry me out on a stretcher because I was too weak to walk, and I was rushed to the nearest hospital for emergency treatment. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I was suffering from severe bacterial gastroenteritis and dehydration that had progressed to the point of kidney dysfunction and electrolyte imbalances that could have been fatal within hours. I spent 5 days in the hospital receiving intravenous antibiotics and fluids, and it took several weeks for my digestive system to fully recover from the effects of the contaminated water. The most disturbing aspect of the experience was learning from park officials that this was not an isolated incident. Several other hikers had reported similar illnesses after drinking from water sources in the same general area, and park biologists had identified multiple contaminated springs and streams caused by animal carcasses and other sources of bacterial contamination. The lesson I learned is that water sources that appear pristine and clean can be deadly, and that natural does not always mean safe. Even in protected wilderness areas like national parks, water sources can be contaminated by factors that are not visible to casual observation. Animal deaths, mineral deposits, and bacterial blooms can all create dangerous conditions in water that looks perfectly safe to drink. I recovered physically from the experience, though I still have some digestive issues that my doctor attributes to the severe bacterial infection I suffered. More significantly, the experience changed my entire approach to wilderness camping and my relationship with natural environments. I now carry multiple water treatment systems and never assume that any water source is safe without proper purification, regardless of how clean it appears. The wilderness is not malicious, but it is indifferent to human needs and assumptions. Nature follows its own rules, and those rules can be deadly for people who assume that natural environments will be safe and benevolent. The spring that nearly killed me was doing exactly what springs do, carrying water from its source to its destination without regard for what that source might contain. Trust your preparation more than your assumptions, and remember that the most dangerous threats in the wilderness are often the ones that look perfectly safe. Clean water is essential for survival, but clean-looking water can kill you just as effectively as any obvious hazard. Always treat water from natural sources, no matter how pristine the environment appears, because you cannot see the bacteria that might be living in that crystal-clear stream. The mountains and forests are beautiful and healing, but they are also completely indifferent to your survival. Respect that indifference by taking every precaution, even when it seems unnecessary. Your life might depend on that paranoia.